Hi everybody, welcome to PHK Inspire. Today our topic will be past, present and future. Is Hong Kong ready for the next pandemic? And we're delighted to have Professor Ben Cowling as our guest. Professor Cowling is the head of the Division of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the University of Hong Kong. He is also a fellow of the Royal Statistical Society and the UK Faculty of Public Health. His main research focus is infectious disease epidemiology and has lately been focusing on areas such as respiratory virus transmission, influenza vaccination effectiveness, and immunity to infections. We'll start today's interview by asking the basic questions. So, what exactly is a virus? Can you explain what is its structure?
A virus is an infectious agent. It's not alive or dead. If it can get into your body and infect your cells, it can use your cells as a factory to reproduce itself. And that's how viruses propagate. So for example, COVID-19, the virus that causes that could get into your lungs. Just one virus can get in. It can infect a cell, turn that cell into a factory and produce thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of copies of itself, which then might go into other cells in your body. Some of them might make their way out and infect another person. And that's how virus is able to spread from one person to another and spread all the way around the world sometimes. They use our bodies as factories for themselves.
So the next question is, roughly 60% of known pathogens and up to 75% of those related to common diseases originate from wild animals, kind of a process we know as zoonosis. So how do they actually become to infect humans?
So that's right. There's a lot of viruses which infect animals. There's a lot more animals in the world than humans. So a lot of these viruses in animals, occasionally, some types of viruses can infect not only animals, but also humans. Now, some of these viruses would never have the chance to infect humans. Some coronaviruses that live in wild animals in the middle of the jungle where there's no humans. But occasionally, what we find is an animal virus, maybe a bat virus, in the example of COVID-19, is able to make that jump into humans. And actually, it discovers that it can spread in humans. We know of some zoonotic infections which can't really spread efficiently in humans. For example, you remember avian influenza, H5N1, H7N9. There's other examples of serious infectious diseases as well from Asia and other parts of the world. So there's some of these viruses can infect humans, sometimes can cause quite nasty disease, but don't transmit efficiently. But then occasionally we get viruses like the one causing COVID-19 that jumps into humans and finds actually it can spread from one human to another quite efficiently. And that's when we have a problem. And I'm sure there's a lot of other viruses in the wild which could spread between humans if they were given the chance. And that's one reason we need to be very, very careful about the interface between wild animals, especially bats, and humans. And as human societies encroach on bat territory, that's when we get opportunities. Or of course, if there's places in the world where they hunt bats and eat them, that may not be a good idea. And sometimes bats can spread infection to other wild animals in the forests or the jungles, and then humans hunt those other animals. And that may well be, for example, the way that Ebola virus has been able to get into humans in some parts of Africa in recent years, that it's not directly from wild animals, it's come from a bat to a monkey, and then humans have hunted the monkey and eaten the monkey, and that got infected with Ebola. So that happens as well.
All right. So just a follow-up thing. Why are bats so well? We have heard of like bats transmitting viruses quite a lot often than other animals. Why is that the case?
It's a really good question. So different kinds of viruses often have a preference for different types of animals or whatever. So humans are mammals. Of course, we got chickens and ducks, which are birds. We got other types of reptiles and fish and so on. And there's often viruses that are specifically equipped to transmit in certain groups. So viruses that transmit very well in birds, not so well in humans. Viruses that spread well in mammals often have a better chance to spread in humans as well. And bats have a very interesting and unique immune system. So viruses like COVID-19 and also many other serious viruses that you may have heard of, those viruses are able to survive in bats, sometimes without even causing disease because of the way the bat's immune system works. But then once they make to jump to humans, they can be really, really nasty. And that's a special feature of bats. They're this kind of unusual mammal, a lot of unusual things about them. They fly, they live in a forest jungle often. They don't have a lot of contact with humans or in some cases, many other kinds of mammals. But when they do, we see infections jump from bats to those other creatures. And as with COVID-19, that can be really, really a big problem.
So moving on to the next question. So we have heard about these words epidemic and pandemic showing up quite often. But what is actually the difference between epidemic and pandemic?
So the definition of epidemic is when number of infections of a specific type rise above a level and become maybe noticeable or of concern. So for influenza is a really good example. Often that people can get flu all around a year in a place like the United Kingdom or the United States. People bring back infection from overseas, even in the summer. But you only tend to see influenza spread in the winter months. So we'll have an influenza epidemic, which lasts for maybe 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks. Also true in Hong Kong. We have a winter flu season most years, lasts for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks. And that's when there's more of influenza going around. Lots and lots of people getting infected all around the same time. And then after the epidemic's finished, then the virus kind of goes away. It may not go completely to zero, but it goes away and it's not really a concern until the next epidemic comes along. A pandemic is when we have a brand new infection that spreads around the world and causes epidemics everywhere it goes. So whereas with flu, some places will have an epidemic from one year to another. If there's a new strain of influenza, like we had in 2009, or with this COVID-19, or with other infections, when that emerges, it spreads easily around the world because lots and lots of people haven't ever had it before. That's when we have a pandemic. And pandemics are really a particular concern for public health because they can have such a high health impact, as we're seeing now with COVID-19. But we've had other pandemics in the past 10, 20 years. I mean, Zika virus seemed like it might be a big concern. And then it turned out after a while, we decided it wasn't such a big concern after all. 2009, we had a pandemic of influenza, 2009 H1N1, which everybody was worried about in the very beginning. And then they decided it's not such a big deal compared to seasonal flu. COVID-19, though, I think is going to change everybody's perspective on pandemics, that we've been worried about this kind of thing happening for many, many years. And now it's here and it's really demonstrating the danger of these kind of pandemics, that it disrupts the whole world. So many countries on lockdown, so many people getting sick. Here we're about millions and millions of cases on a daily basis sometimes.
So to conclude, then epidemic is mostly local, and then many epidemics can join to form a pandemic, which is global.
Yeah, pandemic by definition has to be a global event when there's a new infection that's spreading around the world. Technically, a pandemic is also like an epidemic, but it's an epidemic around the world. It's not just an epidemic in one place, but epidemics could be local.
Yeah, I see.
So, Professor Carling, as a leading expert in epidemiology in your field, can you brief us, like, what actually is epidemiology? What do epidemiologists study? And in your past research or your current research, what are your main approaches or perspectives in studying these epidemiological problems?
Sure. So epidemiology is the study of people's health in populations and the application of that knowledge to improve people's health. So the first thing that we do is to study, what do people get sick with? Sometimes what do people die from? And why? Why do some people get diabetes, others don't? Why do some people have heart disease, other people don't? Why do some people get COVID-19, other people don't? And then when we can understand the processes, we can make recommendations to governments and ministers for health and so on what they could do. For example, with COVID-19 spreading, we recommend you consider asking people to work from home. or, should you keep schools closed? Should people wear masks? All these kind of questions are the questions that epidemiologists answer. So whereas medical doctors, focus on the patient that they're seeing in front of them, what's the best thing to do for this patient? What treatment should I give them? What diagnosis should I make? What surgery or other procedure should I do? In epidemiology, we're focusing on populations. So we're thinking about what's the characteristics of people who get sick versus who don't. And individuals are kind of aggregated together. So we're analyzing quite often larger data sets and looking for patterns in the data set. So using statistical techniques and also using our knowledge of diseases and disease processes, all those kind of things. So there's usually no undergraduate degree in epidemiology. It's a postgraduate subject because it's advanced and it borrows from a lot of other disciplines. It borrows from medicine, from health sciences, from biological sciences, from statistics and mathematics, economics, business studies. So many different disciplines all go together to form the field of epidemiology. And epidemiologists have to know a little bit about all those different disciplines in order to be good at their jobs. So, I really like it. I studied myself a degree in mathematics, a PhD in statistics, and then I got into epidemiology after that. And I really, really like it because I can use my mathematical knowledge, my statistical knowledge. Also, I can learn about diseases and disease processes, and the work that I'm doing can have a real impact. I can give advice to government ministers. I can share my knowledge with the community on what's good to do or not to do. And I feel like all the work that I've done in the past 15 years has been really of great benefit now to me as I try to figure out what's going on with COVID-19 in Hong Kong and, of course, in the rest of the world.
Actually, you brought up interesting aspect about the graduate school thing. So I think many of our audience members will be secondary schools, and they are really preparing for entering the university and thinking about the career or academic interest in the future. What would you suggest to our audience that how they can work toward to become an epidemiologist in the future, or just to enter the grad school with an epidemiology degree?
Yeah, so there's no specific pathway into being an epidemiologist. And the place that I work in, Hong Kong University, in the School of Public Health, we have people from many different backgrounds, many different undergraduate degrees. So if some people in the audience are thinking about what they want to study and they think it might be interesting eventually to get into epidemiology, then a quantitative degree would be really useful. That could be mathematics, statistics, physics, or some other sciences. Also, medical related subjects, whether it's medicine, medical sciences, health sciences, or biological sciences, biomedicals, any of those kind of things could end up as finding a way into epidemiology. And of course, other doors would open up depending on those degrees. But there's no specific undergraduate degree for this discipline. It really takes years and years of study. So maybe an undergraduate degree, maybe a master's degree, and then a doctoral degree, a PhD, and then start getting into the field and learning the ropes of epidemiology. So it is really, really an exciting field. And I think, a year ago, most people in the world would have no idea what an epidemiologist was. Now is common knowledge because it's on the news every night. They're talking about epidemiology and interviewing epidemiologists and so on. So it's an exciting time for the discipline.
Talking of epidemiology, from not really someone would think of studying to the star today. Yeah, we have had another epidemic. I believe that was an epidemic known as SARS back in 2003 in Hong Kong, which was also known as one of the worst disease breakouts back then. And and it actually caused more than 1,700 infected and caused almost 300 people dying. So how would you compare to COVID-19 to SARS? So the first thing I think we can compare is SARS died out relatively quickly, which was shown that by the year of 2004, there are no more new infected cases. So it went out in 1 year's time. So have we really completely eradicated SARS? And would COVID-19 die out like SARS once did?
Yep, it's a really good question. I could actually talk a little bit about SARS. So it began probably in November 2002 in Guangdong province. A bat, so the SARS coronaviruses, which cause SARS and also cause COVID-19, are found commonly in bats. And so the originating virus of SARS most likely came from a bat, maybe in Guangdong province. The likely intermediate animal is thought to be a civet cat. That's a small mammal that's sometimes caught and eaten in wet markets in Guangdong province. And the civet cats are thought to be the creature that was responsible for bringing the SARS virus from bats to humans. So somehow, somewhere, maybe November 2002, a person got infected with the SARS coronavirus and managed to pass on the infection to a few other people. Most likely, it was just one person that started it. The virus circulated a little bit in Guangdong province, and it got to Hong Kong in early 2003, when a doctor who'd been treating patients with pneumonia in China came for an academic conference in Hong Kong. And the hotel that he stayed in was a busy hotel in Mongkok. And it just so happened that he managed to infect quite a number of other residents of the same hotel. And it was a hotel with people from around the world. So those guests took the infection to lots and lots of other places, to Taiwan, to Singapore, to Vietnam, to Canada and Ireland, I think the USA, so many different places, all got this seeding of infections from this initial case in Hong Kong, in one of the hotels in Mongkok. In Hong Kong, the infection was able to spread, particularly in hospitals, not so much in the community, although there was one big outbreak in a housing estate called Amoy Gardens in Kowloon Bay. Apart from that, there was not so much transmission in the community. It was really scary for the doctors and nurses because they didn't know what was going on. There were this pneumonia. Usually the people that get pneumonia are older people, really elderly people, quite frail. They get pneumonia, they have to go to hospital and they get quite sick and sometimes don't recover. But this new pneumonia in 2003 was infecting not only the elderly, but doctors and nurses, and they were getting really sick and in some cases dying from this serious new disease. So they figured out it was something new. They were able to identify it was a coronavirus, I think probably March of 2003. And once they figured out it was mostly spreading in hospitals, they were able to achieve control of transmission. So initially, one SARS patient was infecting on average 3 other people. That meant that the first one maybe infected a few others. The next one infected, those next people infected a few others. On average, there were 3. It could have been more, could have been less, but on average, it was 3. But once it was identified how the virus was spreading, then the infection control teams in the hospitals really clamped down. All the doctors and nurses have to be really, really careful, wear masks, wear the other equipment, wash their hands all the time. And any case needs to be managed very, very carefully. So don't put them in the ward with all other patients, put them in a special room to isolate them. And all of these control measures were able to reduce that number of secondary cases from 3 down to below 1. And that meant that once there was a patient, on average, they wouldn't spread it to another person. They spread it to less than 1. And the numbers of cases went down, down, down. So by July, it had gone away in Hong Kong. I think globally, there are about 10,000 confirmed cases of SARS or likely cases of SARS. And almost 20% of those were in Hong Kong. So Hong Kong's a really small place. It had more cases than almost anywhere else. I think Beijing had the most. It had 5,000. And then Hong Kong was second. And then other places in the world were less affected. So SARS didn't disappear in July 2003. We got rid of it. We eliminated it through really trying very, very hard in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, Canada, other parts of the world that were affected. Really, it was a success story because if those efforts hadn't been made, it would have spread much further and could have even turned into a global pandemic. But I think we were really, really good, or my predecessors were really, really good in controlling it. And since about July 2003, it disappeared. Most likely, there are still similar viruses in bats. The only SARS cases that occurred after that were in Beijing, when a laboratory scientist who was working with the SARS virus in a high security lab accidentally infected themselves and also managed to pass infection onto their relative. And that was in, I think, the summer of 2004. That was a bit scary. but there's been no further cases ever since then. So SARS is really a success story for public health, that by human effort, we were able to stop a pandemic before it could get started and, eliminate a really nasty infection.
I see. So, but then does that mean that like COVID-19 we're already way too late, and how could we contain it?
Yeah. So the aim for COVID-19 is the same as for SARS, to get rid of it, to eliminate it, but it's much, much more difficult. Whereas SARS mostly spread in hospitals from patients who were quite sick. So the best way to control SARS is to find those people who are looking really sick. They got pneumonia and they're really, really sick patients. Find them and isolate them and stop them from passing on infection. And patients with SARS were most contagious about a week after their symptoms had appeared, which is the point when they're in hospital. And so with good infection control, it was possible to deal with SARS. For COVID-19, it's much nastier, but it's funny because it's much nastier because it's so mild. So whereas with SARS, about 15% of patients who got SARS died. With COVID-19, it's 0.5%. That's way, way lower. 15% versus 0.5. You think it would be better, but actually it's worse, because with COVID-19, it means there's so many mild cases in the community, you never even find them, and they can be passing on infection. So it turns out COVID-19 is almost impossible to stop spreading unless we go for these kind of lockdowns. If everywhere in the world had lockdown and said everybody's got to stay in their home for the month of January 2020, then maybe we would have had a chance to eliminate it, because it just wouldn't have had a chance to spread outside of China and in other parts of the world. But that didn't happen, and now it's everywhere. So the US has had a lockdown. Now they're coming out of it. Their case numbers are relatively lower, but going up again. Other parts of the world have had low numbers, which are now higher. So even if the US had got it down to 0, they would have reintroduction from other parts of the world almost immediately. And unless the whole world goes into lockdown simultaneously, which I think is impossible, we're not going to see elimination of COVID-19 for some time. Maybe if we get a vaccine, we could think about using it around the world. And we remember there was one previous infection was eliminated by vaccination. That's called smallpox. In the 1970s, it was eliminated successfully from the world by vaccinating everybody, basically. And so there's no more smallpox. But we haven't had that success with any other infection. With COVID-19, it's going to be difficult.
Since that you bring up the interesting topic of vaccination, I think it will be interesting for our audience to know a bit about the theoretical rationale why vaccines could work in some cases. And so, well, I know the vaccine is inducing passive immunity in humans. And how does vaccine actually work on the population level to contain an epidemic like this? And where are we about in these rays of vaccination?
So I can do a little bit of history, a nice story. Going back hundreds of years, there was a scientist in the United Kingdom identified an interesting phenomenon. It was about smallpox, actually. He identified the strange phenomenon that milkmaids, that's the girls who milk cows, didn't get smallpox. And cows have a very similar infection to smallpox. It's called cowpox. So he had a hypothesis. He said, what if he could give other people cowpox? Would they also then be immune to getting smallpox like the milkmaids were? And so he got some concoction related to cowpox and he injected it into some people and then demonstrated that after the inoculation, they were immune to smallpox. And that was a really brilliant idea. So he was giving the people a milder infection to protect them against a more severe infection, noting that the immunity seemed to go across the two different infections. Nowadays, we have vaccines against a lot of different infections. The most common approach to vaccination is getting the virus of interest, killing it, and then injecting it into you. So for example, we get the influenza virus, we kill it, and then we inject it into your bloodstream or into your muscle, and your body will generate a response to that particular dead virus, thinking that it might be alive. And so if you were to encounter that virus in the future, you'd have some immunity against it. Maybe not perfect immunity. You might still get infected, but you might not. So there's some degree of protection that you can get from that kind of vaccination. There's other types of vaccine, like there's a nasal spray flu vaccine, there's a polio vaccine, which is a live but weakened pathogen. So we'll get a virus like polio or like influenza, deliberately weaken it in the laboratory to make it a milder variant of itself, and then infect a person, me or you, with that weaker virus. So we'll have a very weak and very mild infection and then develop immunity against other types of the virus. And for the polio virus, the live vaccine works really, really well. It's really a good idea. There's just one tiny problem, that sometimes the weakened virus gets its strength back. And so something like 1 in a million people who get the live polio vaccine actually develop polio, which is not good, So that's why live viruses are sometimes, you have to be a little bit careful. And unfortunately, vaccines don't always work the way we intended. There are some stories in the past 50, 100 years of vaccines that have been tested, and it turns out not only they don't work, I mean, that would be one problem, but they make things worse. So in other words, you get a vaccine that's an experimental vaccine, and then later on you encounter the disease and you actually get a worse form of the disease than you would have done if you hadn't been vaccinated. And so for COVID-19, scientists are being really, really careful about the vaccines that are being tested and the vaccines that will eventually be used, because I mean, we want a vaccine that works. If a vaccine is tested and it doesn't have any effect, then that's bad news. But if there's a vaccine that's tested and it makes things worse, that would be a total disaster. And so we really want to avoid that. And so there's a number of procedures that scientists need to go through when they're developing these kind of vaccines, especially for a new disease like COVID-19, to really make sure that the vaccine is going to be going to work well.
Great. So also back to a little bit about SARS. So after SARS, it's now there's a more than a decade gap between SARS and COVID-19, and I'll be really interested to know, like, if the Hong Kong the public health system, or let's say the governance, has built up some sort of capacity during this period in between the epidemics that actually strengthen the system itself to prepare a unknown pandemic, well, like COVID-19 before it got breakout. What sort of public health system capacity has been built up since then, since SARS?
Yeah, so a lot of investment was made in the systems in Hong Kong to prepare better after SARS. So the first thing is surveillance. When SARS first came, it took a little bit of time to detect that it was a new virus and to identify what the virus was like. So that delay is now much shorter. For COVID-19, we were able to identify very, very quickly that it was a new coronavirus. And the way we can do that now is with more advanced technologies that have been available, and also more capacity for laboratory testing. So 15 years ago, if you or I got admitted to a hospital in Hong Kong with pneumonia, we wouldn't be tested. The doctors would try and figure out what treatment they could give us, that would cover all the bases. Whatever we had, they'd give us antibiotics or some other thing, some supportive care, and trust that we'd get better. Nowadays, if you or I was admitted to a hospital in Hong Kong with pneumonia, we'd be tested for everything the doctors can think of, because the laboratory testing capacity has been built up, so that in the past, most people were not tested. Now most people are tested. The second thing that's really been strengthened is isolation rooms in hospitals. Those were really critical in SARS, but we didn't have a lot of them. Now in Hong Kong, we have about 30,000 hospital beds, and more than 1,000 of those are these special isolation rooms for people with nasty infections that we want to keep away from the other patients. And that's been really, really valuable in COVID-19. And the training for infection control staff has been really improved as well. So I mentioned earlier about SARS that, one of the key things was getting doctors to wear masks, to wash their hands, to wear the other equipment, and to be really, really careful around SARS patients. So that's now ingrained in doctors and nurses in Hong Kong after 15 years. And we see we hardly have any infections in healthcare workers in Hong Kong. Hardly any doctors or nurses have got COVID-19. But you compare that with Italy, with London, with New York, so many doctors and nurses got infected. And that's because they have not invested in the training and the equipment and the preparations that we've done in Hong Kong. And then one last thing is we recognized in SARS that one of the ways that was able to allow us to control it, to get on top of the situation, was by doing what's called contact tracing. That means if you or I had SARS in 2004, the government would figure out who we might have infected. So maybe our family members or our friends, and track them down and get them into a special facility for quarantine, maybe a hotel, a holiday camp or somewhere. So that if our family members had unfortunately been infected, they'd already be isolated before their symptoms even appear, and then unable to pass on infection. For COVID-19, contact tracing has been a really, really important thing to do. And Hong Kong's been really good at doing it. Singapore as well, and they were affected by SARS in 2003. Other parts of the world, really not so good, and now learning how to do it. And you may have seen the World Health Organization recommending that contact tracing is really an important thing to do. And so Hong Kong's ahead of the game on that, because we learned all about that in 2004 and have been ready for it ever since. Other parts of the world are really, just learning about it now.
Yeah. So we've been talking about comparing SARS with COVID-19 for a while, and now maybe we can compare it with something else, like comparing COVID-19 to the regular seasonal influenza.
Yep.
So that's what a comparison a lot of people made at first, and told people not to be afraid of COVID-19. It's not going to be much of a big deal. But turns out it's not. And COVID-19 has been way more serious than your average seasonal flu.
Yep.
So what are their main differences?
Yep.
And what would be the problems if we treated COVID-19 like we usually did with the seasonal flu?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So firstly, the similarities. So flu is an infection of the respiratory tract, infection of maybe the nose, the sinuses, the throat, and the lungs. And so is COVID-19. Both infect the same parts of our body. They both spread in the same kind of way. So if one of us had flu and we're talking to the other one, maybe coughing or just breathing for a prolonged period of time, maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour, the other person would have a chance of being infected. That's the same for COVID-19. So the degree of contagiousness is relatively similar. Also, for flu, people are most infectious around the time their symptoms appear, not later on. Remember, for SARS, it's about a week after symptoms appear. For flu, it's at the point when symptoms appear, people are most contagious. And that's true for COVID-19 as well. But then the difference is COVID-19 is much more serious infection than influenza. So whereas for people who get flu, probably you'd need about 10,000 to 100,000 people to get flu infection before one of them might die. It's less than that in elderly. It's a more serious infection in elderly, but you need a lot of people to get infected with the flu virus before someone dies. With COVID-19, it's about 1 in every 200. So it's a much more serious infection. And we did some calculations in the early days of COVID-19 to imagine what might happen. So with seasonal flu, most years in Hong Kong, the government really doesn't do much about it. It just comes. Lots of people get flu, so they're sick for a few days in bed maybe, and then back to normal again. Unfortunately, in Hong Kong, about 1,000 people die from seasonal flu every year, but mostly very vulnerable people, very old people, people who are quite frail already. It's quite unusual for a child to die of flu. If there's one child dies of flu in Hong Kong, it's front page news, and there's a lot of concern. Occasionally, there's a heavier flu season, and the government might close schools. We've done that a few times in the last few years. Maybe do some other measures as well, but in general, will not do much to stop the flu. And so in a typical flu epidemic, there'll be about 1 million, 2 million people infected, and just maybe 1,000 deaths at most. For COVID-19, we did some number crunching to see what might happen if the government ignored it, which they did not, and they should not. If they had ignored it, what might happen? Because we know the mortality rate is much higher, we thought maybe, what if there's 3 million, 4 million, 5 million people infected with COVID-19? How many people might die? The answer is tens of thousands. At the peak, if there were 2 million people infected, how many people would need to go to intensive care? A lot, way more than our capacity for intensive care. How many people will need to go to hospital? A lot, way more than all of our hospital beds in Hong Kong. So we have about 30,000 beds in Hong Kong for people in hospital. Of course, people with all kinds of different diseases need to go to hospital, not just with flu or COVID-19. In the flu season, out of those 30,000, maybe 5 to 10,000 are occupied with flu patients at most. And that's when the hospitals get really, really full. With COVID-19, it'd be way more than that. It'd be 100,000 plus people needing hospitalization at the peak, way more than we could cope with. So the government in Hong Kong and governments elsewhere recognized it's really not a good idea to allow COVID-19 to spread. If you remember, Northern Italy, really the hospitals were overwhelmed. And that was at quite an early point in the epidemic. In London and in New York as well, hospitals got really, really busy to the point of being overwhelmed. And that was not the peak of their epidemic. That was when it was still going up. And if the government hadn't intervened, it would have doubled and doubled again, and maybe even doubled again after that. So really, very, very serious impact. So when we think about the similarities, differences between flu and COVID-19, they do share some similarities in the way they spread, but they're different in their seriousness. And that means we have to treat them very differently. We have to think about them in very differently in terms of what public health measures would be justified. We can't just think it's like the flu. We need to try a lot harder to stop it from spreading, because otherwise the health impact would be devastating.
Professor Carlin, you mentioned something about the demographics of the vulnerable people in flu and also in COVID-19. And we know that, well, old people seem to be quite vulnerable to COVID-19. A question will be, seeing that this is a global pandemic, do we actually see that other factors, for example, socioeconomic status, plays a role in shaping these vulnerable profile in different countries, or are there other factors that really make different?
One of the things that's been really interesting to study, as speaking as a scientist, is how the vulnerable groups in many societies are affected, the lower socioeconomic status workers. So if you imagine what happens in a lockdown in London, all of the people that work in the high-paying jobs in the office blocks can work at home. They can use their computer to talk to their colleagues, to do their work. But all the people that do the lower level jobs, so driving the buses, cleaning the streets, working in the shops and so on, all of those people still need to go to work. So unfortunately, what we've seen in many parts of the world is that there's a lot higher risk of infection in those groups of people, the group with a lower socioeconomic status. And in many parts of the world, those are also the minorities. So it's the racial minorities. We know in London, there were really high infection rates among the Black and the Asian and Middle Eastern population in London compared to the white population in London. And it's not the race, it's the socioeconomic status that's really a major factor in that. So there's no evidence that those people are more vulnerable to getting a serious infection if they get infected, but they seem to have a much higher risk of infection because they're exposed, because they're driving the buses, because they're working in the shops and so on. And they're not able to stay at home. They're not able to participate in the lockdown that's protecting many of the other people in the community. So it's been a really unfortunate story. I mean, I heard a lot of bus drivers in London got really seriously ill with COVID-19, for example. And in Hong Kong, in our third wave now, we're seeing a lot of impact in the same types of people, the taxi drivers, the people who work in shops and so on, and restaurants, that those are the people that are getting the serious infections, not the people that have high-paying office jobs that work at home and can stay at home and don't need to go to work every day in the same way.
Do you think it's possible to use some public health measures or strengthen the public health system to kind of mitigate these, what we can call an inequity in these demographics?
Yeah, so one of the things that really concerns me is that often these lower income workers still need to go to work even when they're sick, and they're used to doing that. So let's say a bus driver's got the flu, he still needs to report for duty, otherwise he'll be in trouble with his supervisor and maybe even in danger of losing his job. And some of these jobs are hourly paid or daily paid. So if you don't go to work, you don't get the pay. And so our community has forced these particular workers to go to work even when they're sick. And then that's when we see transmission continuing, that we would prefer people to stay at home if they're sick. And that's the public health advice. but we haven't enabled that to happen because of the way that these jobs are structured, because they don't have sick leave, and because the companies are really running on very tight margins. So if workers don't appear, it's really a big problem for the company. And I think ordinarily in flu season, that may not be such a big issue, but with COVID-19, it turns into a really big issue. I think we're going to see some interesting information coming out soon about the extent to which people have had to work while they're sick with COVID-19. And that's really going to shock people that, we have all of these lockdowns, we have all of these public health advisories saying if you've even got a tickle in your throat, stay at home. And people do, unless they have to work, because if they don't work, they don't get paid, and then they don't have money for their expenses and for their family and so on. And it's really, really unfortunate. And that's making it more difficult to stop COVID-19 from spreading in the community.
Yep. And speaking of staying home, we have actually seen another strange phenomenon happening, especially in Hong Kong, where we have had these house pets actually getting infected. So is this actually a sign of like reverse zoonosis? And does it have any will it be any of concern that maybe like even if we eliminated the virus in humans, and then it might still stay in animals and it might have an outbreak again? These sort of problems.
Right. So this kind of thing can happen. I'll give you an example. So in 1918, we had an influenza pandemic called Spanish flu, killed 50 million people around the world. Really the nastiest flu pandemic we know about. It was H1N1. And sometime between 1918 and 1950, that virus got into pigs. And it stayed in pigs. So when that virus disappeared from humans in about 1950, it kept going in pigs. And so in humans, we've had lots of other flu viruses ever since then. But the pig virus, the 1918-like pandemic influenza H1N1, was in pigs all the way through until 2009, and it jumped back to humans. And that was a relative of the 1918 virus, a descendant, which caused our 2009 H1N1 pandemic. So pigs, of course, there's millions and millions of pigs around the world, and they're farmed in high density. For domestic pets like dogs and cats, I don't think the same thing would really happen because there's not the density of animals that would allow it to happen. But in some cases, we can imagine there would be a risk. Let's say there's a family member gets COVID and passes it to their dog, and then the dog goes on a walk or goes to the dog park and transmits infection to other dogs, and then it's those other dogs that are the source of infection for their families. So it could happen. We haven't seen that happen yet, but it's a possibility. Fortunately, we've been able to catch those small number of infections in domestic animals in Hong Kong, domestic pets, before there's any opportunity for transmission to occur. And it's not clear that the dogs and cats are contagious. They might be, but it does indicate that we need to be even more careful with something like COVID-19. I don't think we'll be in a situation where we eliminate it from humans, but it's still around in dogs or cats. If it could jump into other animals like pigs, maybe there'd be more of a risk, but we have not seen that happening so far. To be honest, I'd be more worried about another bat coronavirus coming into humans in 5 years or 10 years time and causing another pandemic. We've had SARS, then COVID-19, there could be another one. I'd be more concerned about that than this particular virus getting into animals and somehow going that way. Because I think most likely once we get COVID vaccines, then humans will be protected for many years from this specific virus. We just need to be concerned about what's coming afterwards.
That's really informative. So on a separate topic, we talked briefly about how we can contain the pandemic. And one key crucial thing is actually masks, as we found out. Can you brief us how effective have masks been so far, and how do masks really work to reduce the rate of infection?
Yep. So good question. I'll talk about masks first, then I'll talk about other measures. So imagine I've got COVID-19. Every time I cough, every time I talk, every time I breathe, a little bit of virus is coming out. Not a lot, but a little bit. If I wear a mask, it's going to block some of that virus from getting out into the environment. It's going to catch some of the virus in the mask. It wouldn't catch all of it. It will catch some of it. And of course, I'm not going to wear the mask all the time. When I go to a restaurant, maybe sometimes, in other places, I'll take the mask off. So it's not going to work all the time. And even when I'm wearing it, it doesn't stop everything from getting out into the environment. It just stops some of it. Another scenario, let's say I don't have COVID-19, but I'm worried about getting it. When I go out onto the street, when I get in a bus, in the underground train, the MTR, go to my office, if I'm wearing a mask, it's acting as a filter for the air that I breathe in. And if there was a little bit of virus in the air, the mask might be able to stop it. It might not. It's not 100% effective, but it might be able to help. So if there was just a little bit of virus around and I was wearing a mask, I'd probably have a reduced risk of infection. If I was in a place where there was an enormous amount of virus, if I went into the hospital ward where there were COVID patients, I don't think it would be enough. I think the risk would be too high at that point. There'd be too much virus around. And even if the mask filtered out 90% of it, still there'd be enough left to get in. So what we recognize is that masks reduce the risk of transmission or reduce the risk of infection, but they're not perfect. What we've seen in Hong Kong ever since February is almost everybody's wearing masks, almost all the time. So on the street, in public transport, in schools, in workplaces, and so on, everyone's wearing masks, 99% plus. It dipped a little bit in June, but now it's back up to 99%. Even so, even with everybody wearing masks, we've still got spread of COVID-19 in Hong Kong. We're having a third wave now with more than 1,000 cases in the past month. And that's despite everybody wearing masks. So that tells us masks help. We know that masks help, but it's not enough. We need other public health measures as well. So what are the other kind of measures we can think about? So the basic concept of how COVID-19 spreads from one person to another is it spreads when the two people are in proximity to each other for a little bit of time. So the way to stop it from spreading is to stop that from happening. Totally ideal world. Everybody stays in their own room at home for a month. So there's no chance for one person to meet another person and to pass infection to them. In reality, we can't do that. But what we can do is encourage people to spend more time at home. It's called social distancing or physical distancing. And the way to achieve that is to recommend people work at home, recommend some businesses close, maybe close schools, and facilitate people to stay at home more often so they don't have the same chance of exposure in the community. If they do need to go out into the community, we can also reduce the risk by wearing masks, by encouraging people to wash their hands more, to be aware of maybe there might be virus in the environment, on handrails and so on, and do all those kind of individual things, individual behaviors that reduce the chance of transmission. So those are the general measures in the population as a whole. And if everybody follows those, we'll definitely have less transmission. And then we come on to the specific measures. So that's if we can find the people in Hong Kong or somewhere else that have COVID-19, if we can stop them from spreading, it'll be really, really good. And that's a targeted way to do it. So we don't need to disrupt everybody's lives. We just find the people who've unfortunately got the infection and isolate them in hospital. We're really good at doing that in Hong Kong. But unfortunately, what we found is by the time we find COVID-19 cases, whether it's a taxi driver, a person in an elderly home, a person living with their family somewhere in Tin Shui Wai, whatever, wherever we found these cases, often these people have passed on infection to their family members, to their friends and colleagues by the time we've identified them. So we're too late. What we need to do is trace the contacts. So if I've got COVID-19, if I'm diagnosed, find out who I might have already passed infection onto, even though they don't have any symptoms, trace those contacts, my family members, my work colleagues, my social contacts, and put them somewhere where even if they have been infected, they won't pass on infection. That's a way of getting ahead of the virus. So we identify and isolate cases in hospital at the moment, and we do contact tracing and quarantine of contacts to get ahead of the virus and to try and stop it from going further and further and further. And in Hong Kong, that's been really, really helpful. If we had not been doing contact tracing, I think we'd be in more trouble. We'd have more cases, and we'd probably be looking at having to use the kind of measures that are used in the UK, other European countries, and the US, like total lockdowns, so stay-at-home orders. We haven't had to do that so far, thankfully, in Hong Kong. And it's because of all of these measures that we've used in combination with each other.
Moving on to another topic. So back to what we're talking about, epidemiology.
Mm-hmm.
Like we study these measures, we study these like infections, how past epidemics spread,
mm-hmm.
and how can we use them like to predict about future pandemics, and can we actually do so? How useful is that?
Yeah, you got so many good questions for me. There was a really interesting project started a few years ago. The concept was to identify all kinds of viruses in the wild, for example, all the coronaviruses in bats, and then try to rank them in terms of how nasty they might be if they got into humans, and how easy might they find it to spread in humans. If we'd found COVID-19 a few years ago, maybe we could have been better prepared. We would have had an earlier warning. On the other hand, though, it's not clear that if we'd have found the COVID-19 virus or viruses like it 3 years ago, we would have known what it meant. I don't know if we'd have been able to say that this is a really, really dangerous virus and we've got to start making a vaccine so that, now, today, July 2020, we got a vaccine already. I mean, that would be the dream. But in reality, it's still not clear how we can distinguish which of the million bat coronaviruses are the threats to humans and which ones don't pose a threat, because we can't make vaccines to all of them. We have to pick and choose which ones to really follow up. But that's one of the things that could be done in the coming years: better surveillance of viruses in wild animals that pose a threat to humans. And there's an enormous field of research on how to identify those viruses, how to rank them in terms of the threat they pose to humans, and then setting up early warning systems in humans, like there was in Wuhan, to identify as quickly as possible when a new virus emerges. And that's one of the things that China did really well after SARS. It created this early warning system. So if there's a young adult with pneumonia admitted to hospital in a place like Wuhan, they really try hard to figure out what it is, because they're worried it could be another SARS. And that system was the system that picked up COVID-19. Another thing that we can do to prepare better is to follow actually the Hong Kong model. Hong Kong's done really well. So strengthen laboratory testing in hospitals, strengthen infection control in hospitals for when there are patients with these new infections, and have the public health system ready to do contact tracing and quarantine, as we've been doing in Hong Kong. We've seen so many countries now trying really hard to establish contact tracing systems, and it's difficult to set up from scratch. It's really difficult. So in Hong Kong, we've got that system in place already, and we're using it.
Professor Carlin, you mentioned briefly about the future surveillance and also laboratory testing. And personally, I'm still in the UK. I probably don't follow that tightly with the news in Hong Kong, but I seem to be aware of that. The laboratory testing is actually hitting its ceiling pretty soon in Hong Kong.
Yep.
And I'm just interested to know, is it possible to build up the capacity of testing and surveillance, not only in the governmental sectors or commercial laboratory testing, but doing it in more like widely, for example, in the laboratories in the universities, or something like more decentralized, but also building up the capacity?
Yeah, so there's a number of issues to resolve to boost up testing capacity. In the early days of COVID-19, we were able to test maybe 3,000 people a day, 3,000 patients a day. That was enough. Now we're going up towards 10,000 or even more per day. So the first issue is having the laboratory space and the equipment, like the machines that you need to do those kind of tests. And those are not so difficult to come by. Laboratory space is not everywhere, but there are a lot of places that can be repurposed for laboratories. And actually, you may well remember the story in Wuhan back in February, they built a hospital in 7 days. You probably remember, like built a brand new hospital for thousands of patients in 7 days. At the same time, it wasn't so widely reported. They built a laboratory in a week that could test 10,000 samples a day. They just built it from scratch. So find a place that they can do it, put the buildings up, get the machines in. And that's a way to really ramp up testing capacity. We could do that in Hong Kong as well. But the other issues that we need to resolve, every time you do a test for coronavirus, you need some specialized chemicals. Those chemicals, you can't get them on the street. They're really very specialized. Only a few companies in the world make them, and they're quite expensive. And there's not an enormous supply of them. So that's a limiting factor. Right now, we've got a good supply of it, but not everywhere in the world can access those chemicals. They're called reagents. Not everywhere in the world can get them, and that's been a problem. And then the last part is the humans, the staff. So even if we build a brand new laboratory that can test enormous numbers of samples every day, we need to get the people to handle the samples, to operate the machines, and to interpret the test results. And it often takes a lot of training to be able to do that. We can retrain people from other types, people who've been doing, the cholesterol levels in people's blood. Maybe those kind of technicians could be retrained to do coronavirus tests, but we don't often have a lot of those kind of laboratory technicians either. So that's another limiting factor. And of course, a coronavirus test is not only putting the sample in the machine and then, click, 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 get the coronavirus result. It's all the things that lead up to that. It's handling the sample in the first place very carefully. It's using the chemicals in the right order with the right processes, and then putting it in the test machine. So there's a lot of things to resolve. In Hong Kong, we are ramping up testing capacity, just like everywhere else in the world. And I think one of the things we can look forward to in the coming months is having more regular testing of people at higher risk of infection, or in people where there will be a higher consequence of infection. And the group that I would really like to see being tested every week are the staff who work in elderly homes in Hong Kong, also in the United Kingdom. So if we could arrange that all those staff, nurses and assistants who look after the elderly, if all those people could be tested every week, we could stop these outbreaks in elderly homes that are really, really nasty. When a virus gets into an elderly home, infects a lot of residents, they're often very frail already. That's when we see an enormous health impact of COVID-19, and we want that to stop. So by having more test capacity, we can just test people even without any symptoms, just do regular testing week on week, again and again and again, to really get on top of the virus and to stop it from spreading.
Yep. And speaking of these measures, testing, we have had back to Wuhan, we have had this whole city testing. Back, I think in May or June, to test all the residents in Wuhan to make sure that no one is having the virus. And then in Taiwan, they're doing a more advanced contact tracing through GPS and phones. Are these measures these measures are something that Hong Kong has not adapted? And do you think Hong Kong should adapt these measures in fighting maybe COVID-19 or a future virus?
So what happened in Wuhan with the mass testing was remarkable, and they also did that in Beijing. So the way they achieved it, there's about probably 5 or 6 million people that they ended up testing in Wuhan. They didn't test 6 million samples one by one by one. They didn't do 6 million tests. They got 10 people samples together and did one test. And if it was positive, which was quite unusual, then they go back to the original 10 and do those again. So instead of having to do 6 million tests, they did 600,000 tests, plus, the small number that came back positive, they do the original 10 again and again and again, but really very small number of those. So in Hong Kong, we could envisage doing that at some point in the future. But if we have the capacity for 10,000 tests a day, that would still take a long time to do hundreds of thousands of tests. It would still take a lot longer than it took in Wuhan, when they just put everything they had. All the labs were dedicated to doing these hundreds of thousands of tests over the space of about a week. In Taiwan, you mentioned the contact tracing using GPS and whatever. That's actually controversial. And in China, they do that as well. In most parts of the world, people don't like the idea of the government tracking where they've been and what they've been doing. They consider it's like private information. So there's been a lot of discussion about how contact tracing could be operationalized. If you remember back in China, there were a lot of stories about how they identified a COVID case and then they followed them from the moment they left their home, on the bus to work, once they get to their work, and they looked at all the CCTVs all the way along in the bus, in the office, in the elevators, and they were able to use facial recognition in China to identify every single person that had a chance to have been infected. That's really, really effective. But in most parts of the world, it's not possible. People wouldn't accept the idea of them being monitored everywhere, wouldn't accept the idea of facial recognition being used to identify them and so on. So we're stuck in Hong Kong. We do it the old-fashioned way with interviewing the case, asking, who did you meet? Can you tell me their telephone number? How long did you meet for? And then judging whether it's necessary to get in touch with them and maybe to ask them to go to quarantine. So it does mean that in China, maybe in Taiwan, other places, contact tracing is more effective in some sense, but it's just not possible in other parts of the world. There's been a lot of debates about privacy of information and so on. And right now, we're relying on old-fashioned technologies in most parts of the world.
Right. I think that will be all for today. Thank you for joining this interview, and we hope to maybe we hope to see you next time talking about how we dealt with COVID-19 successfully.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully we'll have a vaccine maybe later this year, and then we're going to have questions. I'll end on one interesting idea. So imagine we get a vaccine in Hong Kong or the United Kingdom. What are we going to do with it? Okay, let me give you a concept. Line up everybody in Hong Kong, or line up everybody in the United Kingdom from oldest to youngest. So in Hong Kong, you have a line of 7 million people, from the most elderly through to the youngest baby. Most likely with the COVID-19 vaccine, we're going to start at one end of that line. We're going to start with the elderly, and we're going to go along the line as far as we can. If we get 1 million vaccines, we're going to vaccinate the 1 million oldest people in Hong Kong. If we get 2 million vaccines, we'll go to the 2 million oldest. And that may go down to about age 55, age 60, maybe age 50, whatever. Okay, the question is, how far down that line do we need to go before we can say, let's go back to normal? Let's not worry about COVID anymore. Do we need to go all the way down the line, 7 million people in Hong Kong vaccinated, or can we stop? Because I have a feeling that if we get 1 million or 2 million down the line, we've protected the most vulnerable people against COVID. If I got COVID, if you who was listening got COVID, it'd probably be mild, probably be okay, no big deal. So how many vaccines do we need, and what's the best way to use them in order that we can start getting back to normal? In the long run, we may want to vaccinate everybody, but we won't have enough vaccine to do that initially. So, that's something I'm thinking about right now. It's a really interesting question, and it needs the skills of an epidemiologist to really think about, because it's about mathematics of disease transmission. It's about the biology of the disease and the health and the impact. Also about the economics of the vaccine, the cost of, buying the vaccine and using it versus the money that we're saved by going back to normal and so on. So it's really a fascinating question, and, maybe some inspiration for some of you.
Yep. That sounds like an interesting thing to think about as well. Yeah. Thank you today for
Good to talk to you. All right. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Speak again.
Bye.
Bye-bye.